Depending on how you define it, Psychobilly might only be one band, or it might be a vibrant subculture that started in the 80s and lives on. Or it might be a merging of two genres that's been done in a variety of ways since the 1950s. Because this is Eclecticism, we're going to talk about all of those interpretations, the history of Psychobilly, and a lot of the bands you ought to explore if you're intrigued by this genre. We'll cover the essentials, the tangentials, the not quite Psychobilly but still great, and the history of how the genre became what it is. I'm Michael, and this is Eclecticism, a love letter to music. I'm just getting back from a month-long break from making videos, and I'm feeling really well rested and glad to be back. Last year around this time I had 3 Halloween-themed videos, but this year I was on break for basically all of October. So this is sort of a late Halloween video, and it's a topic picked by members of the Eclecticism Patreon. This episode is dedicated to David Springer. Thanks to everyone who subscribed, both the longtime subscribers and those of you who have found the channel from the newer videos on shoegaze and doom. I try not to focus on numbers, but I do want to say thanks for helping the channel to hit 10,000 subscribers during my hiatus. That's awesome. If you're curious to hear the music I talk about here, check out the playlist linked in the description, or subscribe to the Patreon where you can see the same video with music samples actually included, which YouTube won't really let me do on here. I've always found Psychobilly an incredibly fun genre, and today we're going through the predecessors of that music scene, looking at the Psychobilly youth culture in the UK, and we're covering some of the many great bands that have come along since then to change the sound of Psychobilly. We're not going to make it all the way up to the present day, but we're going to get through what we have time to. So I'm excited to be doing another video with a lot of history and chapters. And the first of those chapters is... Without rockabilly, you'd have no Psychobilly, and rockabilly was a hybrid itself, taking elements of rock and roll, R&B, country, western swing, and electric blues. The word rockabilly was a blending of rock and roll and hillbilly, a shorthand for country-related genres like western swing, blues, boogie woogie, and even that is a simplification of the blending that rockabilly really was. At first, nobody knew what to call it. Elvis is someone who gets a lot more credit than he's due with crafting the sound of rock and roll. He didn't invent rock and roll, and a lot of his success was built on covers of songs by black artists. But his influence on rockabilly has to be recognized. Elvis merged R&B with western swing in the track That's All Right, which was initially refused radio play by both the country and the R&B stations because it was too white for one and too black for the other. After one DJ finally took a chance and played the track, the song immediately started getting a lot of buzz. His earliest singles often paired a more or less R&B track on one side with a more country-leaning track on the other side. This was during a time when music was often as segregated as the bathrooms, and it was a risk that led to Elvis's career starting to gain momentum. People were excited about this. So despite Elvis having a bad habit of taking credit for vocal styles, dance styles, and even songs that he didn't actually come up with, let's give Elvis some flowers for being important to rockabilly. But even then, let's acknowledge how much Elvis was toning down the frenetic swinging R&B of Little Richard, whose manic debut album, Here's Little Richard, is an absolutely essential piece of rock music history. His flamboyant performance style would be toned down by white artists who would have bigger hits with his songs later on. In fact, that became such a phenomenon, it kept happening so many times, white artists toning down Little Richard's songs and then having huge success with them, that Little Richard recorded a song called Long Tall Sally, intentionally trying to make a song that was too fast and aggressive for any of those white imitators to attempt. It didn't quite work out that way. Eddie Cochran, Elvis, and the Beatles would all go on to cover it, among others. Gene Vincent and the Blue Caps are not quite Psychobilly, but there's a slightly wild edge to Gene's vocals and the band's performance, and Gene Vincent's band illustrates something I think is important to mention here. At this time in the 50s, rockabilly held a sort of punk-like place in popular culture. It was mixing different working-class styles of music to make something that the average suburban parents would freak out about. It sounded rowdy, noisy, it had literal shouting, and on top of that, it had clear connections to black music at a time when racism was commonplace and a little less subtle than it is in America right now. All of this to say that despite rockabilly having kind of a vague novelty or quaintness to it now, during the 50s it was pushing the boundaries of what was acceptable. It was a bit punk. The word psychobilly actually comes from a song recorded by Johnny Cash, One Piece at a Time, where he describes the car he built, one piece at a time, as a psychobilly Cadillac. The next time the word psychobilly was used, it was by a band building a reputation in New York City during the punk era, who referred to themselves as Psychobilly or Rockabilly Voodoo on promotional flyers. And that band is the Cramps. The Cramps were formed by husband and wife duo Poison Ivy Rorschach and Lux Interior, who fused their love of music with their love of campy B-movies to create a sound that blended both into a distinctly retro horror style that fit closely enough with the punk scene to play clubs like CBGB's as they were getting started. Their sound included Poison Ivy's surf-inspired guitar licks, which often played alongside a second guitar. There's a humor to the lyrics and performance of Lux Interior that reflects the campy outsider artists that inspired them. And this contrasts wonderfully with the cool and detached playing of Poison Ivy. Other talented musicians filtered through the band, but it was this creepy couple who kept the band going until the untimely death of Lux in 2009. For your psychobilly studies, you really need to hear Songs the Lord Taught Us, the debut album by the Cramps. This shows them at their roughest and most bizarre, since over time they would settle into more of an established sound. Psychedelic Jungle is a more psychedelic and less punk direction for the band, but it does have some of their highest musical peaks on it. And I would recommend hearing one of their later albums to see what they evolved into, which was a little less horror-focused and a bit more of a funny, horny rockabilly sound. They could be accused of becoming more formulaic over time, but since I love that formula, I don't mind that at all. Lux and Ivy had a deep love of B-movies and underground music, with an extensive collection of early blues, rock, and rockabilly records. Many of these private press releases with very few copies. For example, a brilliant little single by The Phantom called Love Me, which was influential on the Cramps and the UK psychobilly scene that we'll get to shortly. This song's been cited by the Cramps and by the Meteors as being the first psychobilly song. Their always growing record collection formed the primordial ooze that their sound grew out of, informing the mix of outsider rockabilly, with the speed and aggression of punk. This was the first time a band was consciously mixing rockabilly with punk, because punk was still a new concept at that time. However, the Cramps declared themselves a rock and roll band, not psychobilly. They were firmly connected to their musical roots, and would never shift with the psychobilly scene when it came around. However, their mix of punk, surf, and rockabilly with horror and pin-up imagery would be a blending that the entire psychobilly genre would be inspired by. And if you're diving into this genre, the Cramps are way too influential to ignore. If we were browsing through Lux and Ivy's record collection, we'd find a lot of weird shit. One artist who might catch our attention is Hasil Adkins, an outsider rockabilly artist who made some incredibly strange music for the 50s, and didn't end up getting the opportunity to release a full-length album until the 1980s. But his singles from the 50s would be a big influence on the Cramps and later bands. His vocal performances are unhinged, just shouting and shrieking sometimes, mumbling incoherently at others. He had many songs that fit horror themes, particularly songs about murder. He also had a preoccupation with chicken. He wrote so many songs about chicken that he was able to later release a compilation called Poultry in Motion. The compilation Out to Hunch is a great one for exploring the strange world of Hasil Adkins. And if your idea of psychobilly is deranged rockabilly, this is much weirder than most of what would come later. But it might not be weirder than the legendary Stardust Cowboy, or The Ledge, as he's affectionately known. Norman Carl Odom was obsessed with both westerns and outer space ever since he was a child, and these twin fantasies formed the obsessions of his lyrics. He made a handful of early singles that ranged from incredibly fast and noisy, like Paralyzed, to more bizarrely outer space romantic, like I Took a Ride on a Gemini Spaceship. These early and weird recordings led to him being a favorite of David Bowie, who borrowed the Stardust part of his name when he decided to create the Ziggy Stardust persona. There's a recent EP called Paralyzed which brings together all of those early recordings, and this is some essential outsider weirdness that I definitely recommend checking out. Like Hasil Adkins, this gets discussed as psychobilly just for being unhinged and obscure early rockabilly. And here you have a mixing of B-movie genres with music that could generously be said to sound rockabilly, although there's not a whole lot of musical technique going on. But it has even more charm for just how unrefined it is. Someone could dedicate a whole channel to exploring the oddities you might find in the Cramps record collection, but let's move on and talk about what happened when the London kids started hearing the Cramps and putting their own spin on a punk rockabilly sound. So it might be hard to imagine for those of us who grew up elsewhere, but the UK had a thriving rockabilly youth subculture at the same time that the punk explosion was happening. A lot of genres that in the US were only briefly popular ended up having a dedicated scene in the UK that would last decades. How is that a thing? Well, the drinking age in the UK is 16, and the age for getting into bars is only 14. So teenagers who are at the prime age for forming their identities can already be a part of the music scene. There were tons of bands because kids could fairly easily get involved and start playing shows with a low barrier of entry. So you had teddy boys who were dedicated to rock and roll, rockabillys into rockabilly, and you of course had the punk scene. So it was only natural that someone would decide to take the aggression of punk and mix it with rockabilly, especially when the Cramps were already showing one way of doing that. The first UK psychobilly band was the Meteors, who formed in 1980, and there were some bands who were adding a bit more punk aggression to the sound of rockabilly, like the Polecats, but with the Meteors it was just a bit too far for the rockabilly crowd to fully accept them. Lead singer Paul Fennick was spitting up blood and growling out angry, raspy lyrics. Nothing about them fit the more clean-cut rockabilly fashion either, they just felt different. So a new subculture started to grow around the Meteors, and other UK bands started up, making a fusion of punk and rockabilly as well. The rockabilly scene was full of big, quiff hairdos, so the psychobillies would make them mohawk high and would dye them crazy colors. There were a lot of bands in this scene, even from early on. The Sharks, King Kurt, Guana Batz, but the Meteors adopted the motto, "Only the Meteors are pure psychobilly." This reflected the idea that they wouldn't add anything to their sound that isn't an essential element, and they seem to take pride in sticking to the same chords throughout a career that's still going. Because of this, I think there are a lot of good starting points with exploring the Meteors. In Heaven, their debut album, captures their sound really well. Their most well-known album might be The Wrecking Crew, although Fennick disliked the production of the album enough that he began learning about sound design. And by their next album, Stampede, he was doing the production work himself. So if you want to hear the Meteors sounding the way they wanted to sound, then check out Stampede, their third album. But really, for their early period, you could also check out Monkey's Breath, which is another well-loved early album. They're a bit like Motorhead or AC/DC though. If you like one of their albums, you're probably going to like all of their albums. They don't go off too much in different directions. So we have the Meteors kicking off a scene in the UK, which quickly developed a new youth subculture around it. A lot of these psychobillies took to calling themselves the Wrecking Crew, and these kids developed a highly aggressive style of slam dancing at the shows, called wrecking. During this early psychobilly era, the rockabilly kids had so much hate for this new style that they would show up outside of Meteors gigs with baseball bats, ready to rumble with the Wrecking Crew. Alec Palau of the Stingrays classified the various music styles that melded in the original wave, rockabilly, garage rock, punk, under the broader label of trash. I think this concept's actually more relevant to the style than it seems at first. Musically and lyrically, psychobilly was influenced by genres that were dismissed as low culture, working class, and DIY. Punk, rockabilly, B-movies, and campy horror. All the kinds of stuff that would make older people talk about how degenerate the kids are these days. Lyrics weren't focused on high horror, like Rosemary's Baby or The Exorcist. They mostly focused on B-movie horror, zombies and aliens and cannibals, werewolves, vampires, pin-ups, and exploitation flicks. From its lyrics to its musical influences, psychobilly embraced that which was cast off and dismissed by high society. Psychobilly also presented a supposedly politics-free option focused on just having fun. Forget about speaking out against capitalism and supporting the working class. If you just want to get pissed and thrash around, you could listen to songs about werewolves and zombies. The scene got quite popular in the 80s, growing beyond the local scene where it started with the Meteors. For instance, the Sharks were making what felt more like straight rockabilly, with horror lyrics, finding balance somewhere between the Meteors and Stray Cats. The Guana Batz were another big band in the scene. Although they were technically from the US, they started as a rockabilly band, but after hearing some of the psychobilly going on in England, they changed their sound to not just match the speed of those bands, but to try and surpass it. Their first album, Held Down at Last, is a great example of their sound where you can hear some real bangers of lightning-fast rockabilly, like King Rat and Bust Out. And psychobilly got popular enough that some bands had charting hits in the UK. The band Frenzy formed by ex-members of the Sharks, and they mixed the psychobilly double bass with what sounds a lot like new wave guitars for a really entertaining mashup that doesn't feel that punk or that rockabilly, honestly. But it still shows off some good songwriting. And it also shows how you can flex the usual instrumentation of psychobilly to fit more of a new wave sound that was ready for the radio. But before you start thinking the UK scene went pop and fell apart, there was a second wave that I honestly think was more enjoyable than the first. And this second wave was kicked off with the chaos of Demented Argo. They were from Wales, but they moved to London in order to try and make a living off of music. Their first album, In Sickness and in Health, was recorded in less than a day, and almost all of the tracks on the album were first takes. That urgency carries through in the final product, and it's one of my favorite albums from the UK scene. However, they'd go on to top this album, in my opinion, with Kicked Out of Hell. This didn't come out until 1989, but it made the indie music chart in the UK, and it made the alternative chart in the US. To me, this was the very peak of the UK scene, with a heavier guitar sound that still retains some blues and rockabilly influence. A big part of what makes this go down so well for me is the gravelly vocals of Mark Sparky Phillips, because I do love a vocalist who sounds like they've been drinking whiskey and smoking since birth. This adds extra grit to their sound, and I feel a slight hint of surf and even sometimes Western guitars, which keeps their music varied and engaging. Probably not pure psychobilly, as the Meteors might say, but still really fucking good stuff. I could spend a whole video going in depth on just the British psychobilly scene and it wouldn't be enough. And some of you will probably be telling me in the comments how this scene is the only real psychobilly and how I'm a poser for talking about the Cramps and some of the bands coming up. But I think it's way more interesting to think of psychobilly not just as that youth movement that spread from Britain to other parts of Europe and eventually even the US, but also as any bands that are blending rockabilly with punk. So feel free to complain about my lack of gatekeeping in the comments. I will cover a few more albums from the British scene you'll want to check out if you like the Meteors and Guana Batz and the stuff I've discussed. Check out the first full length by Frantic Flintstones, A Nightmare on Nervous. This band had signed onto Nervous Records for this one, and they're one of the main psychobilly record labels of the era. If you want to keep going deeper, you should look into this label and its bands. But this album is a fun, consistent slab of psychobilly that doesn't reinvent the genre, but it does deliver the goods. The Coffin nails Ein Bier bitte? Maybe? This debut by the Coffin Nails is a lot of fun, with some funny and over-the-top lyrics. This also has the song Let's Wreck, an anthem about that dance known as wrecking. Although the description in the song doesn't quite walk you through the dance steps, with lines like, you can kick the fuck out of mom and dad, stab your sister if it makes you glad. So yeah, it's not the hokey pokey. Finally, from 1989, you have Torment with Three's a Crowd. This is fun, fast, a little less rockabilly than some of this scene, with a little bit more of an accessible feel to it, but the songwriting is good enough that it's still a standout for me. Their debut, Cyclops Carnival, has less of a pop feel to it, and that one's also definitely worth a listen. Throughout the psychobilly scene, the Club Foot nightclub had been a mecca. Both psychobilly and rockabilly bands and DJs made it a hot spot for anyone involved in either of the scenes. But in 1988, the club closed, and this was in a way the beginning of the end for psychobilly as a major cultural scene in England. However, many of these bands are still active. In 2024, the Meteors released what I think is their 24th album, 40 Days of Rotting. And this year, Demented Argo released their 9th album, Psychotic Mutilation. Despite this being their first album in 13 years, the band sounds pretty close to their peak. And this is a varied, aggressive, and fun album. And psychobilly festivals and events in London and throughout Europe still give the Psycho Teds a chance to wreck to their heart's content. As all of this was happening in the UK, some other bands were working on punkabilly in their own ways, and some of those bands became intertwined with the UK scene. Batmobile was a trio from the Netherlands, who became integral to the clubfoot scene, and they were the first band not from the UK to play a show there. They started out trying to make a name for themselves in the Netherlands, covering rock and roll and rockabilly songs with an ultra-fast style. Apparently they left quite a few local farmers confused. They eventually started building up enough of a name locally to try playing some shows abroad, and they ended up at the Club Foot. Their first gig was playing with Demented Argo and Torment. From there, the rest was history, with Batmobile becoming one of the biggest names in the scene. As you might guess from their origins, they feel more inspired by rockabilly than by punk, and you could really call most of their music caffeinated rockabilly. But unlike a band like the Stray Cats, who avoided being associated with the psychobilly scene, Batmobile embraced the scene and became a big part of it. They have a lot of good material, but I would start with their self-titled debut EP. Their second album, Bail Was Set at 6 Million, is a personal favorite too. Although this is a situation where the differences in quality between the first few is quite small. If you like the Stray Cats or rockabilly bands and want to hear that sound at a more frantic pace, without it going too far in the punk direction, this band is for you. Then a little later, you had Mad Sin from Berlin, Germany. They formed in '87, and their debut dropped in '88, with the cumbersome title, Chills and Thrills and a Drama of Mad Sins and Mystery. This one's a highlight of late '80s psychobilly for me, and then they hit a later high point with 2002's Survival of the Sickest. By this point, they turned the speed up a lot and have metal influences on the guitar in some parts as well. The band has mentioned being influenced by everything from psychobilly to country to blues and metal, and you can hear this range in this awesome album. Now, there are a couple bands from LA who often have the psychobilly label thrown at them, but they didn't have any real connection to the scene, that I can find anyway. These bands are the Gun Club and X. The Gun Club has more blues to their sound than rockabilly, and their sound is better described as punk blues, or bluesy post-punk. That said, they were an amazing band, so check them out anyway. Miami has a haunted, bluesy darkness to it that makes it my very favorite, although the first three and the Death Party EP are all, in my eyes, perfect albums. X was part of the California punk scene in the '80s, and their debut album, Los Angeles, has become a punk classic. They blended in some rockabilly to their sound, and the husband-wife duo of Exene Cervenka and John Doe provided some harmonizing vocals that also makes their sound instantly distinct from the other punk bands of the time. Despite most of the praise often going to their first album, my favorite's their third, Under the Big Black Sun. Here, along with the elements they were working with previously, the punk and then the rockabilly, there are touches of country influences in their sound as well. As you can probably tell from these descriptions, both of these bands are unique and they're worth checking out, but most hardliners are going to say they're not psychobilly. If you want an early American band who really is playing psychobilly, then check out The Quakes from Buffalo, New York. Their second album, Voice of America, is a blistering, tight, intensely fun album that has everything I want out of a psychobilly album, including memorable, strong songwriting. And someone would put a stake through my heart if I left out the Nekromantix. Coming from Denmark, this group is led by Kim Nekroman and his iconic Coffin double bass. They've gone on to become one of the most well-known of the modern psychobilly bands. And when I say modern, they did start back in '89, but they've kept very active throughout the decades since then. And Kim Nekroman's other band, with his wife Patricia Day, is also one of the more popular psychobilly bands, the HorrorPops. Unlike a lot of the bands we've talked about, there are definitely eras of Nekromantix I enjoy and eras I don't. I highly recommend their first few albums, especially Curse of the Coffin, but I do find the newer stuff a bit lackluster. The HorrorPops are fun and turn up the pop-punk elements while still retaining some rockabilly in their sound. If you like pop-punk and want to explore some psychobilly, then I really recommend checking out Hell Yeah, and then the others if that one works for you. And if pop-punk's where you're coming from, you also might want to sell your soul to the Creepshow. This Ontario, Canada band makes some psychobilly horror pop punk that's a lot of fun. On their early material, like Sell Your Soul, you have a really fun mix of genres, with some songs including some misfits like gang vocals, and others with rockabilly rhythm and prominent piano, which fits the sound really well. And that's all the psychobilly bands. Good night. Just kidding. Reverend Horton Heat, formed in 1985 in Dallas, Texas. They were one of the bands that got reasonably well known in the US playing psychobilly, along with the Cramps if you count them. We didn't really get the memo about psychobilly until the late 90s beyond these two exceptions. The Good Reverend doesn't rely on horror film lyrics or imagery, instead focusing on more tradbilly topics like hot rods, beer, and women. You can't go wrong with their early work, and I recommend all of their first three as a starting point. Liquor in the Front, Poker in the Rear was my first, so I still have a special place in my heart for that one. In a weird crossover you probably wouldn't expect, this album was produced by Ministry's Al Jourgensen. You really never know where that crazy bastard is going to pop up. And the other band I have to cover here, unless I want to be burned as a heretic, is the band that put psychobilly much more on the map in the US, Tiger Army. I had a friend who completely dismissed Reverend Horton Heat and the Cramps. Then a few years later, she sat me down and excitedly played me Tiger Army. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who had this kind of experience. So what was so different with Tiger Army? Well, they came up in the East Bay punk scene. Their self-titled debut was released on Tim Armstrong's Hellcat Records, so their punk roots were clear. But in terms of their music, they left aside most of the B-movie vibes and had a brooding, romantic sort of approach, which seemed to resonate with a wider fan base. There was still a bit of darkness, but it was less camp and a touch more emotional, maybe even a touch goth. Goth vibe, not goth music. Nick 13 is a talented songwriter, and I enjoy most of the Tiger Army albums, even the ones after they move further from Psychobilly. My favorites though are the first three, which all have great, standout songs that get stuck in my head quite easily. And I think it's important for genres to have some gateway bands. Tiger Army might be the most obvious for someone who's getting into Psychobilly now. There are a lot of fun modern Psychobilly bands that I'd like to cover in this one, but it's getting late, I know you have places to be, so maybe down the road I'll make a video and I'll tell you about Coffin Cats, Ghoultown, The Goddamn Gallows, Washington Dead Cats, Wild Karma, Bobby's Bar, Opossum Holler, The Brains, The Living End, The Radios, The Merry Widows, and Messer Chups, but that'll have to wait. If you enjoyed this video and want to join me on some more musical explorations, then subscribe and turn on your notifications. If you want to support the channel, join us on Patreon, where I share exclusive content and I post all the videos early. For this video, there's a Patreon version with song samples included. Someday maybe I can do that here, but YouTube really punishes creators for it right now, and I don't want my videos to get blocked anywhere in the world. Anyway, thanks for watching Eclecticism, and I'll see you next time.